Every account of Prince Rupert opens with the same triumphant claim. A visionary railway president found the deepest natural harbour on the Pacific coast and built a city to rival Vancouver. That's the postcard version. It doesn't survive contact with the record. The record shows that the man who staked his career on this port never once saw the finished railway he built it for. He died 2 years before the last spike went in, 4 days after leaving London with financing he never lived to spend. I went looking for the reason Prince Rupert, with a natural advantage Vancouver simply didn't have, ended up a footnote instead of the metropolis it was designed to be. I found an answer that has considerably less to do with geography than the postcard admits. Chapter 1. The Man Who Bet Everything on a Map. Start with the man, because the harbour didn't build the city. His ambition did, and his ambition had a specific, documented shape. Charles Melville Hayes was born in Rock Island, Illinois, in May of 1856, an American who never held Canadian citizenship and spent his entire career, from the age of 17, inside railway offices. By 22, he was already secretary to the general manager of the Missouri Pacific Railway. By his 40s, he was running the Grand Trunk Railway of Canada, a company that, by the turn of the 20th century, was losing the fight for the continent's freight to a single, better-positioned rival, the Canadian Pacific Railway, which already owned the only transcontinental line and the only Pacific terminus that mattered, at Vancouver. Here's what doesn't add up if you assume Hayes was simply managing an existing railway well. In 1903, rather than compete with the CPR on the CPR's own line, Hayes proposed something considerably more radical. A second transcontinental railway, the Grand Trunk Pacific, built entirely from scratch across the northern prairies and through the Rockies on a route the CPR hadn't touched, ending not at Vancouver, but at a harbour 450 miles further north, one the CPR had never bothered to develop. That was the entire strategy. Not competing for Vancouver, building around it. The site Hayes picked was Cayenne Island, at the mouth of the Skeena River, and by his own account, the choice was made during a single Pacific Coast tour in 1903, when he and a small party of company officials looked at the harbour and decided, essentially on the spot, that this was where the western terminus would go. Worth holding on to, the harbour's real qualifications were genuine. At roughly 14 miles long, it remains among the deepest natural ice-free harbours on Earth. Some rankings put it third deepest in the world, and Cayenne Island sits measurably closer to the major ports of Asia than either Vancouver or Seattle, a fact the Grand Trunk Pacific would repeat in its promotional literature for the next decade. None of that was invented. What was invented, or at least assumed well ahead of any evidence, was that geography alone would be enough to make the plan work. Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier backed the scheme with a federal government financial guarantee, persuaded by the promise of opening the northern interior to mining, agriculture and forestry alongside the port itself. That guarantee is worth sitting with for a second, because it means the entire gamble, building a 1,800-kilometre railway through some of the most difficult terrain in North America to a harbour with no town on it yet, was underwritten in significant part by the Canadian public. Hayes wasn't risking only his own capital. He was risking the credit of a country that had taken his word for it. So why would a country agree to bankroll a second transcontinental railway to compete with a line that already worked? I kept expecting to find that the answer was purely commercial ambition on Ottawa's part, more capacity, more competition, lower freight rates for prairie farmers. What was actually there was a great deal more entangled with one man's personal conviction that he could outbuild the CPR by geography alone, and a government willing to bet the country's credit on that conviction turning out to be correct. It's worth being precise about just how large that bet actually was. The Grand Trunk Pacific's main line, from Winnipeg to Prince Rupert, ran roughly 3,600 kilometers, much of it through terrain no railway had ever crossed before. Muskeg, mountain passes, river canyons with no existing wagon road, let alone a rail bed. The federal guarantee Laurier extended covered the bonds for the prairie section outright, while the mountain section through British Columbia was financed by the company itself, on the understanding that the harbour at the far end would eventually generate enough Pacific trade to justify the debt. That structure, public money underwriting the easy half, private capital gambling on the hard half, meant that if the harbour end of the plan ever stalled, the company, not the country, would be left holding the exposed portion of the risk. Hayes understood that arithmetic perfectly well. It's part of why he spent his final years crossing the Atlantic repeatedly, in person, trying to keep London's financiers convinced the harbour end was still on schedule. Leave a like, subscribe if you want more of these, and tell me in the comments which Canadian city's founding myth you think deserves the same kind of digging. Chapter 2. The island nobody had heard of. Before 1903, Cayenne Island had no town on it at all. The Tsimshian and Haida peoples had used the surrounding waters as a meeting ground and trade corridor for thousands of years. Archaeological and DNA evidence places continuous habitation on this coast back more than 10,000 years. But the island itself sat outside the existing commercial map of the region. The nearest business centre on the north coast in 1903 was Port Essington, a modest fishing and cannery settlement on the Skeena River, roughly 20 kilometres away, which had functioned as the district's hub for decades and had every reason to expect it would keep doing so. It didn't get the chance. Once the Grand Trunk Pacific fixed its terminus on Cayenne Island, land clearing and town site surveys began there in 1906, under Dominion government surveyor George Blanchard Dodge, and Port Essington's role collapsed almost immediately, bypassed by the businesses and settlers who'd previously used it, and reduced within a generation to a quiet fishing community that would eventually be abandoned altogether. That's worth pausing on, because it's the first instance of a pattern that repeats through this entire story. A single corporate decision, made without local consultation, deciding in one stroke which towns on this coast would live and which would wither. Dodge himself is worth a brief mention, because his career traces the same institutional machinery that made a decision like this possible in the first place. Before joining the federal government's Topographical Survey Division, he had spent years with the British Hydrographic Survey in Newfoundland, and by 1908 he'd been promoted to Chief of the Department of the Interior's Special Survey Division, the same office responsible for translating a railway president's verbal decision on a boat tour into a legally surveyed townsite with numbered lots. Two small features near Prince Rupert, Dodge Cove and a small island once used as a hospital site, still carry his name, a minor but permanent trace of how much of this city's earliest infrastructure was assembled by federal surveyors executing a private company's site selection rather than by any local process of settlement or consultation. A post office opened at the new site on the 23rd of November 1906. By 1909, barely 3 years after the first survey stakes went in, the settlement already had grocers, butchers, banks, hardware stores, clothing shops, hotels, and restaurants, a startlingly fast build-out for a place that, 3 years earlier, had been dense coastal forest with no road access at all. The name came from a nationwide contest the Grand Trunk Pacific ran to christen its new terminus, and this detail tells you a great deal about how deliberately the whole project was being marketed even before a single permanent building stood on the site. More than 12,000 entries came in from across the country, under rules requiring a name of no more than 10 letters or 3 syllables unique to British Columbia. Eleanor MacDonald, a woman in Winnipeg who had likely never seen the harbour she was naming, won the $250 prize for proposing Prince Rupert, after Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the first governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, a 17th-century German-born cavalry commander who, worth noting, never set foot in Canada in his life. The winning newspaper headline ran across the front page of the Globe, "All aboard for Prince Rupert." The city was incorporated on the 10th of March 1910, named, chosen, surveyed and legally chartered all before the railway that justified its existence had laid a single mile of track east of it. So who was actually building this place? The government? The company? Or 12,000 strangers filling out a contest form for a city they'd never visited? None of the above, really. It was being built by a single corporation's marketing department working roughly as fast as its engineering department, and that gap between promotion and construction is where this story's real trouble starts. Chapter 3. Selling the Swamp, one lot at a time. Here's the detail that surprised me most, because it's the part every triumphant version of this story quietly skips. The ground underneath Prince Rupert was not, in any meaningful sense, ready to be a city. Much of Cayenne Island was muskeg, waterlogged, spongy peat bog sitting over bedrock, dotted with stumps from the forest that had just been cleared off it, and the Grand Trunk Pacific sold building lots on that same muskeg, 25 feet wide, for hundreds of dollars apiece, sight unseen, to speculators who never set foot on the property before buying it. That's not a minor footnote about difficult terrain, it's the entire business model of the town site in its first years. The Grand Trunk Pacific contracted the Boston landscape architecture firm Brett, Hall and Company to design an ambitious formal town plan. Curving boulevards, a grand civic core, the trappings of a genuine metropolis, and then sold the actual dirt beneath that plan, plot by plot, to buyers who were purchasing a promise rather than inspecting a property. Prices rose fast enough on land that had been valued at essentially nothing 3 years earlier that by 1909 land speculation had become, by outside accounts, the dominant local economic activity in the town, well ahead of fishing, forestry, or anything the harbour was eventually supposed to generate. The land itself came with a second complication that rarely makes it into the tourist version of this history. Nobody owned the town site outright. Under an agreement between the Grand Trunk Pacific and the government of British Columbia, dated the 2nd of March 1909, and confirmed by an order in council that June, the province retained an undivided 1/4 interest in the unsubdivided lands of the entire town site, meaning that even as the company was selling individual lots to eager speculators, it did not, and never did, hold clear, unencumbered title to a full quarter of the ground it was selling pieces of. Disputes over exactly which lots fell under which portion of that arrangement were still being litigated in provincial records as late as 1915, 5 years after the city's official incorporation. This wasn't unique to Prince Rupert, and it's worth saying so plainly rather than treating it as some special local corruption. The same railway ran into nearly identical trouble roughly 600 kilometers to the east at Fort George, where the Grand Trunk Pacific's refusal to buy into either of two competing pioneer town sites, South Fort George and Central Fort George, set off a bidding war between rival land promoters that dragged on for years and left the eventual city of Prince George permanently split by the argument. The company's approach to town site land, in other words, was consistent across the entire line. Promise a metropolis, sell the ground under it before the ground was fully secured, and let the resulting disputes sort themselves out in provincial arbitration decades later. So was the swamp underneath Prince Rupert ever actually going to hold up a city the way the Boston architects had drawn it? Nobody selling lots in 1909 seems to have asked that question out loud. They were too busy selling the drawing. It's worth adding one more wrinkle here, because it shows how far the land confusion actually reached. In February of 1909, a Vancouver sawmill operator named C.T.W. Piper sued the Grand Trunk Pacific outright over the company's decision to fill in the tidal channel between Watson Island and its own townsite, a land reclamation project that, according to Piper's complaint, blocked the water route he needed to float logs to a pulp factory he was already building nearby. That's a private industrialist taking the railway company to court less than 3 years after the first survey stakes went in, over ground the company was actively reshaping to suit its own townsite plans, regardless of who else had already staked a claim to the surrounding water and land. The dispute over the province's undivided one-quarter interest in the unsubdivided townsite lands, meanwhile, was still generating formal government orders in council as late as November of 1915, 9 years after the original survey, 5 years after incorporation, over land that had, in the interim, been assessed, taxed, subdivided, and sold to ordinary buyers who had no visibility into any of this underlying legal tangle. Blasting a railway through a mountain. If the townsite was being sold faster than it could be surveyed, the railway meant to justify it all was, if anything, moving slower, and at a cost nobody involved had accurately predicted. The Grand Trunk Pacific contracted the construction firm Foley, Welsh and Stewart to build the line eastward from Prince Rupert, and the terrain immediately punished the schedule. The 80-mile stretch from Prince Rupert to Kitsilus Canyon alone required roughly £12 million of explosives to blast 3 tunnels through solid rock, and the full 186-mile section from Prince Rupert to Hazelton took 4 years to complete, from 1908 to 1912, a pace that reflected not incompetence but simple physical reality. This was some of the most difficult railway building terrain anywhere on the continent, and the company had budgeted for something considerably easier. Labour was a constant, grinding problem. By late 1912, the Grand Trunk Pacific had roughly 6,000 men working the line east of Edmonton alone, and the company, citing chronic shortages of workers willing to endure the conditions, petitioned Ottawa for permission to bring in unskilled immigrant labour from Asia, a request that ran headlong into the same racially exclusionary immigration policy Canada applied broadly during this period. Liquor was formally banned in the construction camps. Bootlegging, according to the company's own later accounts, was rampant regardless. Contractors provided rudimentary hospital care by charging each worker $1 a month, a bare minimum safety net for men working with millions of pounds of blasting explosive in remote mountain terrain with no meaningful emergency infrastructure behind them. And here's the number that should reframe the whole visionary railway narrative. As early as 1910, a full 4 years before the line was finished, an internal prediction within the industry had already concluded that if a competing line were ever built from Tête Jaune Cache directly to Vancouver, it would kill Prince Rupert's usefulness outright and reduce the entire Grand Trunk Pacific route to branch line status. That prediction was made in 1910. It came true in less than 15 years. The people building this railway, in other words, had access to the warning that their own project's central premise was fragile, and kept building anyway, because by 1910, the capital, the contracts, and the promises to 12,000 lot buyers were already too far committed to stop. The same townside disputes that tangled Prince Rupert's land title played out along the entire length of the line. And it's worth seeing the pattern repeat before we move on, because it confirms this wasn't a single local problem so much as the company's standard operating procedure. At Fort George, further east, two competing settler-built town sites, South Fort George and Central Fort George, had already sprung up on either side of a Clétlé-Ténère reserve by the time the Grand Trunk Pacific arrived in 1910 looking for its own station site. Rather than buy into either existing settlement, the company tried to purchase the reserve land directly from the First Nation that held it, only to be repeatedly outmaneuvered by a rival land promoter who invited the band's chief to tea on separate occasions, specifically to make sure he understood the land's value to the railway and to advise him against selling cheaply. Multiply that kind of standoff by every divisional point along 3,600 kilometers of new track, and you get some sense of how much of the Grand Trunk Pacific's capital was being consumed not by steel and explosives, but by land negotiations the company kept losing or dragging out for years. Chapter 5. The Hotel That Never Opened. If you want a single physical object that captures the entire gap between what Prince Rupert was promised and what it actually got, it's a hotel that was never finished and whose empty foundation sat in the middle of the town site for years afterward as a fairly blunt piece of unintentional civic honesty. The Grand Trunk Pacific commissioned Francis Rattenbury, the same architect responsible for the British Columbia Legislative Buildings in Victoria and the Empress Hotel on Victoria's harbourfront, arguably the most prestigious architectural name working in the province at the time, to design a grand hotel for Prince Rupert, intended to be one of the largest in the country and the literal centrepiece of Hayes's Metropolis of the North. Rattenbury produced his first sketches in September of 1911 and completed final plans by June of 1913. Groundbreaking on the foundations began that November. Then it stopped. Work halted shortly after the foundation work began and never resumed, killed by the combination of the Grand Trunk Pacific's mounting financial troubles and the outbreak of the First World War the following August. The Chateau Prince Rupert exists today only as architectural drawings and a foundation that was, for years, one of the more visible unfinished structures in the young city, a 500-room monument to ambition sitting exactly where the company's actual finances couldn't follow. I don't think this is a small or decorative detail. It's the pattern of this entire founding story compressed into a single building. Draw the grandest possible version first, sell the promise of it to lot buyers and to the public purse, and let the actual construction lag years, sometimes permanently, behind the promotional material. The hotel wasn't an unlucky exception to how Prince Rupert was built. It was, in miniature, exactly how Prince Rupert was built. There's a specific irony in the choice of architect that's worth sitting with. Rattenbury had, by 1911, already built two of the most enduring monuments to confident, permanent civic ambition anywhere on the Pacific coast: the Legislative Buildings and the Empress Hotel, both still standing in Victoria, both still functioning exactly as intended more than a century later. Hiring him for Prince Rupert wasn't a modest choice. It was a deliberate signal that the Grand Trunk Pacific wanted this hotel read as belonging in the same category of permanent, generation-spanning civic architecture, the kind of building a city builds once it's certain of its own future. The foundation that was actually poured and then abandoned within months sits in stark contrast to that intention. Not a ruin from age or disaster, but an unfinished start, interrupted mid-sentence by a war and a balance sheet, and never picked back up. Chapter 6. The Night the Founder Drowned. By early 1912, Charles Hayes had a specific, urgent problem. The Grand Trunk Pacific needed more capital to finish the line, and he had gone to London personally to find it, meeting with British financiers to shore up funding for a railway that was, by any honest accounting, running well behind schedule and well over budget. He booked his return passage to Canada aboard the RMS Titanic, sailing from Southampton via Cherbourg and Queenstown, travelling with his wife, a daughter, a son-in-law, and his personal secretary. On the night of the 14th of April 1912, the ship struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sank in the early hours of the 15th. Hayes's wife, daughter, and family maid survived. His son-in-law and his secretary did not. Hayes himself did not survive either. His body was recovered from the wreckage site, and the ship's surgeon, in a private letter afterward, described him, in the era's blunt, unsentimental phrase for a notable corpse, as the vessel's star corpse, his name running in newspapers beside those of John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim, the era's other headline-grade Titanic casualties. Even the immediate press coverage got the story wrong in a way that's worth noting, because it shows how genuinely uncertain those first hours were for everyone involved. Early wire reports out of New York suggested Hayes had survived the sinking, and those reports ran before they were corrected, meaning that for at least part of that first news cycle, colleagues and investors on both sides of the Atlantic believed the Grand Trunk Pacific's founder had come through the disaster intact before the more painful correction caught up with the story. His remains were eventually brought back across the Atlantic and buried in Montreal, the city that had been his adopted professional home for most of his Canadian career, roughly 2,500 miles from the harbour that had consumed the last decade of his working life. Here's what I keep coming back to, and it's not the tragedy of the sinking itself, which has been told 1,000 times elsewhere. It's the timing. Hayes died having just secured, or attempted to secure, additional financing for a railway that was already 14 years from its original 1903 conception and still not finished. He never got to spend whatever capital he'd found in London. He never saw the last spike. He never saw a single passenger train pull into the terminus he'd staked his entire professional reputation on building. Even as searchers were still recovering bodies from the wreck site, construction crews were continuing to blast tunnels through the Rockies for a rail line whose driving force had just drowned in the middle of the ocean he was trying to connect to Asia. So did Hayes's death actually cause what happened to Prince Rupert next? Or would the same financial and strategic problems have caught up with the Grand Trunk Pacific regardless of who was alive to manage them? I don't think the honest answer lets you fully separate the two. The company's finances were already strained before April of 1912. But it's also true that the one person with the personal authority, the reputation, and the sheer stubborn will to keep raising capital for an increasingly shaky project was gone. And nobody who came after him in the company's leadership had quite that same combination of conviction and credibility with London's bankers. Chapter 7. The race. It was built to win, and lost. The railway did eventually get finished, just not on the timeline, and not with the outcome its founder had promised. The ceremonial last spike went in on the 7th of April 1914, 1 mile east of Fort Fraser, at a siding called Stewart. 2 years almost to the week after Hayes went into the North Atlantic. By any measure, this should have been the triumphant moment the whole preceding decade had been building toward, a second transcontinental railway, complete, connecting the prairies to a Pacific harbour with a genuine geographic edge over Vancouver. Worth holding on to, The ceremony happened. What it produced next did not match the ambition behind it. The real estate boom that had inflated Prince Rupert's muskeg lots into speculative gold collapsed in 1912, the same year Hayes died. And the First World War, arriving 4 months after the last spike ceremony, redirected the country's shipping priorities almost entirely toward the Atlantic coast and the war effort in Europe, leaving a brand new Pacific terminus with comparatively little cargo to actually move through it. The Grand Trunk Pacific, already overextended before the war, could not survive the combined weight of construction cost overruns, a stalled real estate market, and a wartime economy that had no immediate use for a second transcontinental line to the Pacific. By 1919, the parent Grand Trunk railway system was in receivership. By 1923, the whole network, Grand Trunk Pacific, and several other struggling lines, had been folded by the federal government into a single new entity, Canadian National Railways. And here is the detail that turns this from a story of bad luck into a story of a promise actively broken. When Canadian National consolidated its Western operations, it chose Vancouver, not Prince Rupert, as its primary Western terminus. The 1910 prediction that a Vancouver-connected line would reduce Prince Rupert to branch line status had come true almost exactly as forecast, and it came true through the same government that had guaranteed the original railway's financing in the first place. The city, built from the ground up specifically to bypass Vancouver, ended up, within a single decade of its founder's death, subordinated to Vancouver by the very state that had backed its founding. It's worth being specific about how quickly the financial structure actually failed, because "the war hurt business" understates what happened. The Grand Trunk Pacific's construction costs had already run well past the original projections by the time the last spike went in. The mountain sections through British Columbia, financed privately rather than under Laurier's federal guarantee, proved dramatically more expensive to build than anyone had modelled in 1903. Wartime shipping restrictions and a near-total halt in immigration and land sales after 1914 removed both of the revenue streams, passenger traffic and townside lot sales, that the company had been counting on to service that private debt. By 1919, the parent Grand Trunk system could no longer make its bond payments and was placed in receivership. 4 years of negotiation followed over how or whether to salvage the network at all, before Ottawa settled on full nationalization in 1923 rather than let the country's second-largest railway simply collapse. So who actually decided Prince Rupert would lose the race it was purpose-built to win? Not geography. The harbour was and remains exactly as good as advertised. Not the engineers, who finished an extraordinarily difficult line roughly on the revised schedule. It was a sequence of financial and political decisions made in London boardrooms, in a receivership court, and in a federal railway consolidation, each one individually defensible and cumulatively fatal to the one advantage Prince Rupert was supposed to have over every other Pacific port in the country. Chapter 8. A city kept alive by other people's wars. For most of the next 2 decades, Prince Rupert settled into something considerably smaller than Metropolis of the North. A modest fishing and forestry town of a few thousand people, its role in the national economy reduced to roughly what the 1910 prediction had said it would become. Then, on the 7th of December, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and within days, Prince Rupert's entire strategic value snapped back into focus, not because of its railway, but because of its harbour and its position on the coast closest to the Aleutian Theatre. The United States Army established a sub-port of embarkation at Prince Rupert, and the change in scale was almost as abrupt as the original 1906 townsite boom had been. The city's population, roughly 7,000 before the war, is estimated to have tripled to nearly 21,000 at the peak of wartime activity. Dock space doubled. A single new warehouse added more than 400,000 square feet of storage. A hilltop camp on what's still called Acropolis Hill housed the majority of 3,500 American soldiers and civilian personnel, complete with its own theatre, gymnasium, and mess halls. Between 1942 and 1945, an estimated 73,000 people passed through the port, moving roughly 100,000 tons of high-explosive ammunition toward the Alaska and Pacific theaters. Coastal defense batteries, 8-inch railway guns, in one case hauled out to a spur built specifically for them at a place called Fairview Point, were installed to guard against a Japanese attack that, in the end, never came anywhere near the city. It didn't last, and it was never going to. Once American forces retook the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska in August of 1943, the perceived threat to the coast collapsed almost as quickly as it had appeared, and Prince Rupert experienced what one historical account bluntly calls an exodus. By 1951, the city's population had fallen back below 10,000, smaller than its wartime peak by more than half, and barely above where it had started before Pearl Harbor. What kept the city from sliding straight back into its pre-war dormancy was a single new industry, arriving almost exactly as the wartime boom ended: a pulp mill on nearby Watson Island, which opened in 1951 and would run for close to 50 years, becoming the economic backbone the original railway promise had never quite managed to provide on its own. I kept expecting the pattern here to be Prince Rupert finally finding stable footing on its own terms. What was actually there, again, was a city surviving on whatever external force happened to need it next. First a railway company's ambition, then an American War Department's strategic anxiety, now a single industrial plant processing timber from the surrounding forest. Self-sufficiency, in this story, keeps arriving in someone else's shape. Worth holding on to, too, is how thoroughly wartime Prince Rupert reorganized itself around a foreign army rather than its own civic institutions. The city produced its own wartime newspaper for American personnel, the Daily Acropolis News, alongside a souvenir booklet titled Prince Rupert, Sub-Port of Embarkation, and a dedicated telephone directory listing only U.S. Army lines. A new residential neighborhood, Rushmore Heights, was built specifically to house married shipyard workers as the Prince Rupert dry dock expanded to build naval vessels for the Pacific War effort. None of this civic infrastructure was designed to outlast the emergency that produced it, and almost none of it did. When the Aleutian threat receded in 1943 and the wider war wound down 2 years later, the American administrative apparatus that had run large parts of the city's wartime economy simply packed up and left, taking with it the population, the payroll, and the sense of purpose that had briefly made Prince Rupert the busiest port on the northern coast. Chapter 9. The industry that left. Twice the Watson Island pulp mill carried Prince Rupert through the back half of the 20th century, and for a while it worked well enough that nobody had much reason to revisit the original 1903 promise about the harbour and Asia. Combined with a growing commercial fishing fleet, the mill helped push the city's population to a peak of roughly 18,000 in the early 1990s, the closest Prince Rupert had come, in 80 years, to looking like the metropolis its founder had promised. Then, within a single decade, both pillars gave out. A softwood lumber trade dispute between Canada and the United States hit the forestry sector hard through the 1990s. The commercial fishing industry, which had underpinned the local economy since shortly after the First World War, went into a parallel decline as fish stocks and quotas tightened across the coast. A fish processing plant burned down. Layoffs at the pulp mill accelerated through the late 1990s, and the mill closed for good in 2004. Its nearly 50-year run over. Its site left as a stalled industrial property that would sit unresolved, tangled in lawsuits over ownership and cleanup for more than a decade afterward. The population followed the industry down. From its early 1990s peak near 18,000, the city fell through the late 1990s and early 2000s toward roughly 12,000, where it has hovered ever since, 12,300 at the 2021 census, 12,220 in 2016, essentially flat for 2 decades in a city built, in its founding decade, on the explicit promise of rivaling Vancouver. So is there a version of this story where the mill's closure was simply bad luck? A global pulp market shifting away from a single remote facility, the kind of thing that could have happened to any resource town on the coast? To a point, yes. But it's also, unmistakably, the same underlying vulnerability that runs through this entire history. A city whose economic survival has never once, in over a century, rested on the actual asset it was founded to exploit: the harbour. It rested on a railway company's speculative capital, then an army department's wartime anxiety, then a single pulp mill's market position. And each time that external prop was withdrawn, the city fell back to roughly the size it would have been without it. The years between the mill's closure and the container port's arrival were, by most contemporary accounts, the low point of the city's second century. Between 1996 and 2004, Prince Rupert absorbed the mill layoffs, a fish processing plant burning down, and a population decline steep enough that local commentators openly discussed whether the city's long-term viability was in question at all. The same kind of existential doubt that had briefly surfaced, and been answered only by outside intervention, twice already in this story. First after 1912, and again after 1945. Chapter 10. 50 years late to its own idea. Here's where the story finally, and somewhat belatedly, turns back toward the thing Charles Hayes actually got right in 1903. In 1972, the federal government designated Prince Rupert a national harbour. In 1977, the port opened Fairview Terminal, its first true deep-sea cargo facility, general cargo and forest products, 67 years after the city's incorporation, and 74 years after Hayes first stood on this coast and declared it closer to Asia than any comparable Canadian port. The Prince Rupert Port Authority was established as an independent governing body only in 1997. None of this moved quickly. It moved at roughly the pace you'd expect for a city whose central economic premise had been sitting unexploited for the better part of a century. The real vindication, if that's even the right word for something this delayed, arrived in the 21st century. On the 12th of September 2007, Fairview Terminal opened as a dedicated container port, receiving its first ship from the Chinese carrier COSCO the following month. Phase 1 handled a modest 500,000 TEUs a year. By 2015, expansion had pushed that capacity toward 4 million. Today, the terminal, operated by DP World, advertises itself as the continent's first dedicated ship-to-rail container facility, built specifically around the same claim Hayes made in 1903, that this harbour sits closer to the ports of Asia than Vancouver, Seattle, Los Angeles, or Long Beach, and that the advantage translates directly into faster trans-Pacific shipping times for anyone willing to route cargo through it. A 2005 announcement of container port construction, alongside new ownership at the shuttered pulp mill site and a fresh cruise ship dock, marked what local accounts call the actual turning point. Not a return to the original railway town model at all, but a wholesale replacement of it with something closer to what the harbour had always been suited for. So walk the question all the way back to where it started. Was Charles Hayes wrong about Prince Rupert? Strictly on the geography, no. The harbour is exactly as deep, exactly as ice-free, and exactly as close to Asia as he claimed in 1903, and the numbers moving through Fairview Terminal today are, in their own quiet way, proof he wasn't hallucinating an advantage that didn't exist. What he got wrong, and what an entire century of this city's history has had to absorb the cost of, was the assumption that a genuine geographic edge could carry a city on its own, fast enough, without the underlying finance, the wartime luck, or the market conditions ever slipping. They slipped constantly. A stock market collapse in 1912, a world war in 1914, a corporate bankruptcy in 1919, a federal railway merger in 1923, a wartime exodus in 1943, a trade dispute in the 1990s, a mill closure in 2004. And each time, the city absorbed the shock and shrank back toward whatever size its actual, unsubsidized economy could support. The record was never hidden. It ran in the Globe's front page in 1906, in provincial land title disputes in 1915, in a 1910 industry prediction that came true almost to the letter, in newspaper columns beside Titanic headlines in 1912. What changed isn't the evidence. What changed is that, a century late, the harbour itself finally started earning the reputation the marketing had given it in advance. Prince Rupert wasn't built to lose. It was built to win a race that took it more than 100 years, 3 collapsed industries, and 1 drowned founder to actually finish. Stand on the Fairview waterfront today and watch a post-Panamax vessel work a berth built specifically to move containers off a ship and onto a train within the same afternoon, and the harbour finally looks like what the 1906 promotional literature always claimed it was: the fastest way to move Asian cargo onto the North American rail network. It just took until 2007 to be true in practice rather than in advertising, and it took a foreign port operator, a federal trade initiative, and roughly a century of interruptions to get there, which is a considerably less tidy story than the postcard version this chapter opened by rejecting, and a considerably more honest one.